started, Joe. Don't worry about it. All right, so Chapter 18, talking about the Federal Reserve Agency or the Federal Reserve Department or the Federal Reserve Board, depending on where you want to go. This is the caretaker of money. All right, so before we can start talking about the Fed, right? Caretaker of U.S. money. Before we can jump there, we have to know what money is, first of all. So, how do we define money? What makes money money? Green paper, ink. Is it images of past presidents or historical figures? Is it the fact that it says, "In God we trust"? Or is it because it says "a pluribus unum"? It used to be that, not anymore. Well, what makes money money is that it has to do three things. There are three properties of money that money must satisfy to be considered money. All right? So the first thing that money must do money must be a medium of exchange, which is an economic way of saying you can spend it. Okay? In order for money to be money, people have to be willing to take it in exchange for other stuff. Hence, what we do with our money right now. The other thing that our money has to do, it also must be a unit of account, which is a fancy way of saying there's a number on it. Or it is measurable. And we can measure the value of the money that we're carrying around in our wallets because there's a number on it that tells us this money is worth $1 US, $5 US, $10 US, what have you. Whatever it is, it's got it on there. All right? And the last thing that our money has to do in order to be money is that it must be a store of value. And a store of value basically just means that if it's $1 today, it's $1 tomorrow, it's $1 next week, or it's $1 a year from now. And that same dollar should be worth more or less the same thing for any amount of time it's separated between. So, some people might argue that our current money is not really money. How would they argue it? Because of inflation, right? They could say, you know, this dollar that I have in here was printed in 1972. The dollar in 1972 used to be able to buy me a burger, fries, and a Coke at McDonald's. All of them. Can you go to a McDonald's nowadays with $1 and get a burger, fries, and a Coke for $1? You can get a Coke. So does that mean then that our dollar is not really a dollar anymore? Again, if you want to be a bit of a party snob, you could argue that it's not, right? Because it's not storing its value. Because it's not the same as it was 10 years ago, all right? But then again, is there anything that's worth exactly the same amount as it is today as it was 10 years ago? No. So could anything be money? In which case, then, what the hell's the point of...
Maybe it's not the dollar that's changing value, it's everything else.
Potentially true. And that's the counter-argument to those people who say $1 used to be able to buy me a burger, fries, and a Coke, right? Because they'll say, well, back then, what was the Coke that you bought? It was like 12 ounces. What was the burger you were getting? It was probably 1/8 of a pound of beef, right? What were the fries you were getting? They were probably partially hydrogenated food products, as opposed to being real potatoes, which they are now, right? Define real. I don't want to know. All right. Well, anyways, anything that is money has to satisfy these three traits. And in fact, when anything does satisfy these three traits, it is money. So other than the dollar bills that we have in our back pocket, what else might be money? Gold. Would someone trade me this ring for their shirt on their back? Of course they would, because this thing is a $350 ring, right? I mean, your shirt's probably not worth that much. I mean, if it is, then cool, but, you know. Gems, any sort of precious metal, right? You can spend it because people want it. It's measurable because you can weigh it. And it stores its value because if I make a gold ring today, is it going to be a gold ring 10 years from now? Probably. Depends on whether my wife tells me to get the hell away from her and then I melt it down and sell it for gold, right? You know, let's assume that's not going to happen. But none of you would do that, right? Right? Because technically, while I am still married, this thing is worth more than it's actually worth, right? Because it's sentimental value. Okay. Anyways, so there are lots of things that can be considered money. The question is, are there some things that we might think are money that aren't? So how about like farmers, right? If you think about farmers in Montana is one of the nation's largest cattle growing industry. Do you think cattle are money to those farmers out there? Yeah. Why would I argue that cattle are not money? Well, I know, but if I all of a sudden had a cow, would I still say that cows are not money? Well, yeah, you can. You can go to the stock market and trade that cow in for, whatever you want. Doesn't keep its worth. Why not? They grow old, and then what happens to the cow? It dies. Anything that dies, folks, then it loses its value, unfortunately. So people will sometimes argue that cattle really are money because you can spend them, you can measure them or weigh them, and that really, if the cow is still alive, it's got the same value today that it does tomorrow, that it does next week. But most people would argue cattle, it's not money because of this, all right? Now, I may also claim to you that this is money. How could I argue that this is money? In theory, I could spend it, right? I could trade it for, like, maybe Joe's hat. See? Right? Okay, so it's spendable. Can I measure it? Is this measurable in some way? Sure. I could measure how much it weighs. I could measure the volume it can hold. There's lots of ways to measure it. Is it going to be a mug forever? Maybe. True, but think about a dollar bill. Does a dollar bill lose its value if you cut it in two?
If you cut it in 64.
I mean, what happens if a dollar bill gets mangled in some fashion? Is it not a dollar anymore?
Well, our policy is as long as it's physically poor remnants, we'll still take it, but if it's cut in half and there's no full retail pickup to the bank.
There you go, right? So a dollar is still a dollar even if it's cut in two.
But they have to have at least 51% of the bill. And we were higher than that. She did a new one.
Yeah, usually.
It was 50.
That was it? Wow.
Yeah.
Maybe I should start cutting my dollars up then. Here's one. Hey, here's another one. I'm just trying to get $2 for one, right? I mean,
You could do that because one would be 49% and one would be 50%.
well, what if I was really good and cut it straight at 50%?
I think they noticed. Like,
True, and you could go to a different bank, right? I mean, a bank that takes 49%. Okay, though the fact remains, though, is that yes, the store of value, right? People often will argue, but this can break so easily, and I'm like, but a dollar bill can rip just as easily, right? And probably more easily than this thing could break. Depends on how much of a klutz I am, but true. The reason I broke the last one I had. I was so sad. I'd had that for 5 years too. Yeah, the Saturn one. I shattered it. I was. Yeah. Well.
How many pens will it take for us to get your cup?
All right. So realize that there can be other things that are money besides just money. Please note also that I actually have some money. What do you know? And it's even a 20. How do you know this is not fake?
Watermark. Or the pen.
How do you master watermark copier? Is there any way to really be sure 100% of the time that this is not fake? No. Yeah, I mean these are, I mean, they're tough, I'll grant you that. And this is one of the new 20s, so it's a little bit harder.
The new $100 bill is horrible.
Like Monopoly money.
It's total trash. Although this 20, much more easily faked, by the by, which is kind of cool that I have two of each. Because I almost never have $40. My wife is really nice to me this week.
They look like Monopoly money.
'Cause they're
Everything's huge and blown up on it, and it looks really funny.
they're multicolored too. If you they like change. Nose hairs are important. All right. Well, one of the other things that technically this is not it's not a trait that defines money, but in order for this dollar to be worth anything, to really be spendable, it does have to be at least mildly scarce. All right. So, is our money scarce? It's printed in finite amounts. That's absolutely right. So there's at least a finite number of dollar bills out there. Very rarely would you be able to see someone making leaves dollar money, because there's just too many of them, right? And they get regrown every year, so that it's kind of tough, right? In theory, you might be able to set up your economy such that people will take leaves as a currency, and they could be measurable, right? Because you could say, this is how much area they have, or maybe how much weight they have. And if it's a leaf today, could it be a leaf tomorrow? Sure, why not, right? So, from another perspective, that it could be money, and it tends to be these things, this last sort of necessity, that makes it really not money, right? Because if it's not scarce, then it doesn't really have any value. So yeah, it may store its value, but if its value is almost nothing doesn't get you very far. Very true. All right, so now, you guys keep talking about this gold stuff. Commodity money versus fiat money. So there are two different categories of money. Commodity money, fiat money. Commodity money, this is stuff that satisfies this. This is money that has an alternative purpose or use. So gold is often called commodity money because gold can be spent like money, but it can also be used to do other stuff like, show bondage, right? This is a sign of a ball and chain, right? I mean, it's really a gold ring, but it could also be terminal servitude.
Your wife watch your video?
No, I keep waiting for it to. comments, but I know when she will have actually watched them, because she says, oh yeah, I keep meaning to watch them. I'll know when she watches, because she'll hear this stuff and like...
It'll be this one that she watches.
All right, so there's commodity money. Realize that our dollar bills used to be commodity money. Our money used to be backed by gold. It used to be that $1 was worth $1 worth of gold from Fort Knox, and you could take that dollar bill and walk to Fort Knox or ride a horse, because that was about the last time it was available to you, and trade your dollar bills in for some of our U.S. gold. All right?
Did they open it one more time?
Well, Fort Knox, we'll talk a little bit about Fort Knox in a second. But, so, this, have you ever, any of you guys seen our silverbacks? Yeah, that's back when we first, the last time we had commodity money was the late 50s, back when our money was still backed by silver and gold and other precious gems. You could actually still trade in a $10 bill for silver. Again, it was only for silver-backed coins. Again, that was commodity-based money. It was still dollar bills, but the dollar bills were tied directly to some fixed commodity. All right? And literally what the government said was that based on the amount of gold we have sitting in Fort Knox, we can only print enough money to equal the exact amount of gold that we had. And the nice part about that is that then our dollar bills were not only finite, but guaranteed to be finite unless we somehow as a country got more gold in Fort Knox. And what that did is it gave people solid understanding of how much money was out there, U.S. money, at all times. Right now, how much money is floating around there? Who knows, right? The reason why is because our money is not commodity money anymore. It is now fiat money. This money that is money because you believe it. So if you ever talk to anyone who says they've lost all faith in the American government, you should tell them immediately, fine, give me all your money. Because the only reason that our money is because the U.S. government tells us it is. It's the only reason. It's because we believe. Because it's not backed by anything. There's nothing backing our money, period, other than the fact that the U.S. government says that it's money.
That's what I could go and say, well, tomorrow we're going to use food.
Yeah, in theory, right?
That's what Fort Knox is full of, is food.
And that's why on every bill that you look, it's got this statement. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. Because if it didn't say this, it's not money. The only reason that this is good is because you believe that the U.S. government says that it's good. It's faith. I mean, if you think about it, yeah, if there's a lot of people with no faith in our government, they should really be converting all of their U.S. dollars into something they do believe in, whatever that may be.
Right?
This is legal tender for all debts, public and private.
The new Monopoly has the bigger size money, too.
Oh, that's classic. Okay, so our money is fiat money. What do you think about the rest of the world? Is the rest of the world's commodity money, or is it fiat money? What do you think? Do you think there's still some commodity money out there? None. Zip. There isn't a country out there that has its money based on a solid set of jewels and gems in their vaults. Zero. Everybody's money is fiat. England was the last one to convert. They converted in the 60s. But everybody else is off of any kind of gold or silver or precious gem standard. It's all fiat money, folks. It's all faith. The reason that our fiscal system works in any way, shape, or form is because we all believe. We're all fooled. So that's all there is to it, right? So that should also make you feel a little bit safe, right? I mean, it's one thing for us as Americans to believe in the American government and that our money is money because the American government says so. But it should make you feel a little bit safer that everybody else in every other country's doing the same thing, right? Exactly. I mean, it's all just we're really this is exactly why people come up with movies like The Matrix, right? Because the only reason that we think we're alive is because we believe that we're alive and that we're not really asleep in a chair somewhere where people are sending signals into our brain from a major computer somewhere else. Right. Yeah.
We're Sims and we're run by aliens on another planet.
Yeah, we're just players in a big role-playing game for some other advanced culture. Yeah, amen. So it's not your fault whenever there's a problem in your life. It's the guy who's running you's fault. All right, so this is how we determine that we have money. Now, how do we track money? So, is this the only place that money exists is in my hand? Where? In my checking account, right? But the bank has this number of these in its vault equal to the amount of money I have sitting in my account, right?
No.
What? But every dollar that's out there has to be, right? What? How can that be? I mean, I believe in the U.S. government. Yes, I believe that this is a dollar. How can I believe something that isn't even a physical entity be a dollar? I can spend it and I can buy it, but why? How does it work? Okay, I will tell you. All right, so the way we quote-unquote count money, and again, we is really the Fed, okay? I mean, we can all do some counting too, but it's really the Fed's job to do all of this counting, all right? So one of the things that the Fed did is it said, okay, we need a way to track how much money is in the system because, let's face it, folks, when you go to buy stuff, what does it take? Take some level of money, right? So wait a second. I got a Visa. Is this money? I can spend it, right? Right? It's a unit of account. I know how much money I can spend on this. Is it a store of value? Will I always be able to use this exact same card forever? No. Why can't I use this forever? Because there's an expiration date on every card that you get. Folks, this does not store value. A credit card is not money because it has an expiration date. A debit card, on the other hand, which is directly tied to your bank account, and in order for you to use it, has to be able to connect to the bank and say, you have enough money to pay for this. That people can argue is money. Credit cards, though, unfortunately, yeah. But the nice part about it is that in that sense, the expiration date is just the expiration date of its connection to your bank account. A debit card is just an access to your account, which, as long as it's got money in it, you can spend. And sometimes even when there isn't in there, you can actually spend it too. Usually they try and stop you, but every now and then. Yeah, they like to charge overdrafts, don't they? So sometimes they let you do it anyways. All right, so the Fed anyways, in its infinite wisdom, said, okay, we need to count all of this money that people can spend, because what we really need to measure is what you guys, and I don't just mean you in this classroom, but everybody in the world, how much money do you guys have to spend? Because when you have money, what do you do with it? You spend. It's really, really hard, folks. I mean, it's really hard to see the money and to not spend it. I mean, it's hard. You have to have a little bit of character to have money in your wallet and let it sit there for a length of time. But once you see that you've got $1,000 in your checking account, I mean, You're like, oh, well, $20 for lunch?
That's why my husband doesn't see anything.
That's why I wish I could hide my money from my wife. But anyways, all right, so the Fed said, okay, we need to name this money. And so we need to come up with a really good, clever name. And most of the people that work for the Fed are mathematicians. So the clever name, what's the first letter of money? And what's the first number that you tend to learn? M1 is what the Fed calls money, because it was a mathematician who named it initially. And mathematicians love single letters and single numbers. So M1, and you can actually look this up. If you do a Google search on M1, it'll immediately start pointing you to the Fed's website, which will give you tracking of how much money is in the system. So M1 is the money in the system that people can spend easily. That's what its definition is supposed to be. Where easily I put in quotes because sometimes it's not as easy to spend all of these definitions of money. All right? So, what makes up M1? The first thing is cash, right? It's very easy to spend the cash you have sitting in your wallet, okay? I mean, that's obvious, right? Now, this definition of M1, folks, was created back in the 60s. So bear in mind that the definition is 1960s spending, okay? 60s, 1970s. So what else back in 1960 and 70 could you spend relatively easily other than cash? Checks, right? So all of the money in your checking account is considered part of M1. It's actually considered easily spent money because at the drop of a hat, you can whip out your checkbook, whoosh, use it to pay for stuff, right? Potentially too easy, right? But again, and now, now with these new automatic, check the account amounts, checking things, right, where they can, they can basically run it through like it's a debit card practically, right? Now, what else in the, think 1960s, 1970s was easily spendable? This one's a little bit tough to pull out of your brain. Think about the rich people who travel. When you traveled back in the 60s and 70s, traveler's checks. There you go. So the other thing that the Fed keeps track of are all of the travelers' checks. And please note the way travelers' checks are spelled. Travelers' checks are not C-H-E-C-K. They're always Q-U-E-S. Anyone you get, it's always spelled Old English style. True, they are fancy. Yeah, they're annoying nowadays. I mean, but given with the ease of use of credit cards and debit cards and the connectivity between banks and foreign countries, these traveler's checks they're not as big a deal anymore. But this used to be the way we defined the money supply. So this was the supply of money that we all had that we could relatively easily spend. And again, this was a good, there was a certain percentage of that number that people would look at that would be spent every month. It was just, that's the way it worked, right? And the money just flowed around, and it was relatively, and again, the Fed kept track of it and tried to manipulate the money supply up and down to keep it, quote unquote, even. Now, obviously, as time went by, there were some technological advances that allowed us to be able to access our money a little bit more easily in other places. So we had to define the money supply slightly differently. So guess what the second definition of the money supply is called? Yes. Oh, math is so awesome. You gotta love an economist with a sense of humor. So the real definition of the money supply that the Fed uses is actually M2. They've switched over from M1. Now M2 starts with everything in M1. So if it was easy to spend back in the 60s and 70s, it's still easy to spend it now, folks. I mean, that's pretty synonymous, okay? But checking account, guess what else we can attach relatively quickly to an item that we can use to spend money out of our debit accounts? Yeah, savings accounts, right? It used to be that in order to spend your savings account, you had to physically go to the bank and tell them with a little slip of paper, transfer $2,000 from my saving account to my checking account so that then you could write a check for it. Nowadays, you whip out your debit card and say, oh, I got $1,000 in my savings account. Sweet. Buy me a new dress. Well, of course, I am always model. So now the Fed has included the savings account in what it considers to be the money supply. In addition, again, this is, this is purely from the Fed's analysis. One of the other things that they have been looking at is what other people use to spend money with. Now, this is probably not what you and I would do, but this is, again, the Fed looks at everybody. So what they did is they started analyzing certificates of deposit, CDs. So people were buying like 6, 8, 9-month CDs from banks and trying to get a little bit more interest for their money than they were getting from their savings accounts. And what people were doing is that they would have, say, a $50,000 certificate of deposit that was going to, earn them 6% interest in 8 months. But when with this $50,000 certificate of deposit, they were out shopping and they noticed that there was a new Chrysler that came out and the car was $50,000, and they're like, well, wait a second. I have a certificate of deposit that's $50,000. All I got to do is cash it in, and I can get this nice new car. Yeah, but it's just a little bit of interest penalty. They don't lose the $50,000, right? They just don't earn the interest. So the idea behind it was that they should have been earning interest on it, and you put it in a certificate of deposit so that you couldn't spend it, but we did anyways. So if the certificate of deposit is less than 1 year, so if its a maturity value is less than 1 year from mature, so if you buy a certificate of deposit that's 1 year less, and here was the other caveat, it had to be $100,000 or less. We considered it cash. We do. Right? So if you buy a certificate of deposit for, say, $75,000, and maybe it's a 9-month CD, for whatever reason, we will assume that we could just throw away the interest that we were going to earn on it or take the penalties on it and spend the $75,000 whenever we felt like it. It was basically cash. So this is now how the Fed measures how much money is truly in the money supply. So nope. Extra credit. Find what M2 is. As of November 1st, how much money is in the money supply? What is the date today? Is it the 14th yet? 13th? Okay, so by tomorrow they should have the numbers for the first. Usually they're 2 weeks behind. Again, knock on wood, assuming the Fed doesn't, or the government doesn't shut down again. All right, so this is how the Fed tracks the money supply. All right. How much money do we have to spend is the amount of money that's sitting in M2, which is kind of cool if you think about it. All right, so we've defined what money is. Now, we better define the caretaker. So this should be done in red. So the caretaker of M2 is the Fed. And that red's it's a little light. Let's switch to green. It's the Federal Reserve System. Now, how long has the Fed existed? Anybody know? Yes, you could probably Google it, and it would tell you. All right. Close. All right, so the Fed, first and foremost, 1913. Created by President Woodrow Wilson. He passed a law that gave the Federal Reserve System, or the Fed, the right to take care of our money. In addition, he created the Fed to be independent of the government. To be independent of government. So the Fed, who is taking care of the money, deciding how much there's going to be, and setting the rules for what banks have to do, the government has no control over it whatsoever. Now, the Fed does have to report to Congress twice a year. So twice a year, our good buddy, who's the chairman of the Federal Reserve System right now? Ben Bernanke. He has to go before Congress and tell them what he is doing. He doesn't have to listen to any sorts of whys or whatnot. He just has to tell them what the Fed is doing. That's it. It's a report, not any kind of a manipulation method or a guidance set. Nope, none of that. Right? Ben gets up in front of the Congress and says, here's what the Fed did, here's what the Fed's planning to do, deal with it. Very, very cool. Right, now, Woodrow Wilson, when he created the Federal Reserve System, folks, he almost quit as president when he signed it into law. Think about what he did, right? Prior to 1913, the money in the U.S. was controlled by the government. He gave that away. The government does not control our money. The government does not print money. They don't have the right. The Fed does. Can you imagine any president in the last 20 years who would be willing to give up the power of printing money to an independent agency that they didn't control? Yeah, there have been lots of years where people have been trying to abolish the Fed because they think the government would do a better job at it, which it undoubtedly would, right? Because the government never shuts down or never has really bad arguments such that they can't do anything.
They always have a budget.
And anyways, so the Fed is an independent entity. It is still technically chartered by the federal government, though. The government could, the thing about it is that it can't take it over. So the government couldn't step in and say, okay, now the chairman is now like the vice president of the country or something like that. They can't do that, all right? So, in fact, this is the one testament to the chairman, right? The chairman is acting. The appointments for the federal chair, the Federal Reserve Chair, are done every 4 years off presidential election years. So the presidents are voted on the 6th, the 10th, the 14th years, etc. The Fed is appointed on the other even numbers, right? So the 12th, the 16th year, 2012, 2016. So there will be, there's a decision being made now as to determine whether or not Ben Bernanke should continue to be the Federal Reserve System chairman. And in fact, he's actually asked President Obama if he could resign. So they're actively searching for a new, and already congressmen and congresswomen who are saying, I will never, ever, ever have another person be the Federal Reserve Chairman ever again. I'm like, what? So, forget who it was. There's a couple of Wyoming congressmen who literally do not want the Fed to exist anymore. Don't ask me why necessarily, but they've been saying that the people that the president has earmarked currently, no, they would never vote for them or never pass them as being into the chairman. Because again, there's a vote by Congress to agree that this person should be in the Federal Reserve Chair position. Usually, most of the times, it's a sort of a given, right? If the president picks a federal chairman, everybody kind of says, oh, we'll grill you a little bit and then we'll vote you in, and it's all good. This is the first time where that's being questioned to some degree. Anybody know who the chairman was before Ben Bernanke? Alan Greenspan. Do you know how long he was the Federal Reserve Chairman? 36 years. He existed through 7 different presidents. Every one of them just said, keep it up, Mr. Greenspan. Republican or Democrat, right? Didn't care. Just crank it out. You're doing a great job. Keep doing it, right? In fact, Bernanke's been in there, 10 years now? 12 years now? I think he's been 3 terms. So generally speaking, the Federal Reserve Chairman, he's relatively apolitical, simply because he's in a position of so much power that politics actually doesn't affect him or her, right? They've actually been talking about, nominating a woman for this position. A lot of people think that the Federal Reserve Board Chairman is actually one of the strongest persons in the entire country, either as strong as the president, if not stronger. And it would be a landmark, event if a woman was named one. And it's a good chance it's going to happen. It would be really cool, in my opinion. All right, now, so this is an independent agency. So they report to Congress. Twice a year. Again, blind word here. All they're doing is saying, this is what we did, this is why we're doing it to some degree, and this is what we're probably going to do in the next 6 months. Adjust accordingly. Now, when Woodrow created this Federal Reserve System, he created 12 banks that would govern the banking industry for the United States of America. And if you take a peek in the book, there's a map that tells you where those banks are and what regions they control. I forget what page it's on off the top of my head. 400? What do you know about, what do you note about bank number 12? This is the California region. It covers California, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Nevada, Utah, and Arizona. It's big. Why was that region, created that way? Yeah, I mean, remember, what year was it? 1913, right? Where was most of the business in the United States done in 1913? East Coast, right? Most of our business was done with Europe, very rarely with any of the Eastern Pacific, right? And so that's where we set up most of our banks. Now, since then, they've created 25 new sub-branches. And that's just to fill in all of the spaces where there's been growth in the economy such that they need a bank there to take care of the people that are around it. Okay. Again, it's more for the Fed to be able to have local control over money supply. So part of what the Fed does when it's running these banks is keeping track of how much money is there available not only within the entire world, but within each region of the United States to make sure that there's enough money in the money supply for everything that needs to be done in New York, in Chicago, in LA, in Washington, in Texas, etc. And you may need multiple banks in a relatively close confine to be able to do that, okay? So this is why we've been creating these banks as we've gone along throughout time. Now, let's see. There is a board of governors, since the Federal Reserve System is essentially a public company. I mean, it is a company. It has to have a board of directors. And so what happens is that the board of governors, it has to be a 12-person board. Five of the 12 are always bank presidents. So of these 12 member banks that were first created by the Fed, 5 of those presidents will always be on the board of directors for the Federal Reserve System itself, or the company of the Fed, okay? Note that it is not a majority, right? So there are 7 other places, and those 7 other people are actually, again, 7 are appointed by the president. To 12-year terms. I think it's 12. Somebody take a peek. I think it's 12, but may be wrong. The idea, though, again, is that these are the people who decide essentially what the Federal Reserve is going to do. Mostly, though, what's happened in the past, anyways, is that the chairman has said this is what I think we should do, and that these guys are really just advisors to that person, and they kind of tell him, this is what's going on in our country right now, this is what the money is doing, this is where there's problems, etc. And then the chairman says, okay, based on that, here's what we're going to do. All right. It's a little fishy as to how it works, but normally the board and the chairman go pretty much in the same lines. That doesn't necessarily have to be, and that's the other weird thing about it is that these appointments again have to be verified by Congress. Is it 14? Okay, I knew it was a large number, but so 14 years. And realize right now, President Obama has 2 people to appoint to this board. Everyone he's appointed has been rejected by Congress. Of course, that was the same thing I think that happened with Bush as well. So the board has been down certain members, at least 2 members for the last 8 years. Again, this is why people tend to say that the board doesn't mean much, and it's really the chairman who's the king, because lots of times they can't even get a quorum. You have to have at least 8 people show up to the board meetings for it to actually be an official board meeting. I don't know if you guys have any of you been on committees or anything that have a board of directors? No? I mean, there has to be a certain number of people that show up so that it's called a quorum, and then when you pass laws or bylaws for your company, then they're official. Otherwise, you can just make recommendations for when the board does have a quorum where you can vote on making rules for your company. Yeah, imagine taking 12 of the most powerful, rich people in the world and getting them all in the same room. And folks, there's only one woman on this board. She may as well be an old white man, too. Come on. It's the way it is. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying that's the way it is. All right. Let's see. So, what else? Now, so Federal Reserve System, its job is to take care of our banking industry. So, when the Fed was first created back in 1913 to guide the banks, does anybody know why Woodrow Wilson agreed to do it? Anybody know some early American history, 1890s to the 1910s? What was the biggest problem our country was facing? No, it's 20s. Well, that's the 18s. 1890 to 1910. The biggest problem in the U.S. economy right then was failing banks. What was going on across the country was that there were lots of banks starting up. People would put in their deposits, and normally you would think that banks are nice, good, safe places, right? Nah. What wound up happening was that a lot of these banks, they would start with good intentions. They would collect lots of deposits. They would start making loans. And the problem is that if a bank back in the 1900s made a loan and someone defaulted on the loan, so they quit paying on the loan, what would the bank have to do? They'd have to eat it. They would basically have to try and repossess the people's possessions, but if they couldn't pay the loan off, they didn't have a whole lot of possessions to begin with. And so the banks would often take a serious hit on their bottom line. And if a bank had 2 loans default on it, the bank almost became insolvent. In other words, it couldn't pay payroll, it couldn't exist. And what would you do as a bank president and an owner of a bank? Usually the president and the owner were the same at this stage.
Weren't they taking it from other people that had deposited money too? They were swiping money from their accounts to cover it and then hoping to make it up.
Well, that's what caused the Great Depression in the 20s.
Okay.
In the 1910s, it was just straight up bank presidents saw that their bank was failing because they had 2 or 3 loans default, and they just grabbed as much cash as they could and left town. And anybody who had deposits in the bank, tough luck. There was no FDIC, there was no Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation that would cover all of these individuals who deposited the money in there. So what did all the people who put money in the bank have to do? They had to eat it as well. Or they went out on a witch hunt to try and find the bank president and get all their money back. So this is where posses actually were created. They were initially created not to chase down criminals, but to chase down bank presidents, because they were taking all the money and running. So this is why Woodrow Wilson created it. Yeah, I mean, they were in theory, but that wasn't actually a crime back then, right? I mean, if you had a business and you decided to close the business and take all your money and leave, is that a crime? No. The only reason it's a crime right now is that the U.S. government has passed laws to try and protect the banking industry. Back then, it wasn't. It was the Wild West, folks, right? I mean, closing a bank is just like closing a dime store, right? You take all of your assets and you leave, right? And maybe you pay off your debts before you go, but maybe you don't. There was no laws governing that, right? There's lots of death occurring because of that, right? Yeah, this is the 10s and the 1800s, folks. I mean, it was a lot crueler world back then than it is now. So this is why they existed, and it's so the idea was when he created this that he would give the Federal Reserve System enough power to take some control of that, right? To try and give people security in their deposits, right? So that Americans would feel safe depositing their money into a bank. Because if you don't deposit the money in the bank, how does that money lead to growth in the economy, right? The whole circular flow model. Businesses growing. Where do businesses go to get money? Well, they have to get money from a bank. Well, if nobody's deposited any money into the bank, how can the bank loan businesses money to grow? Wasn't happening. This is why we were stagnating in the 1890s to the 1910s. And it wasn't until the creation of the Federal Reserve System that allowed banks to feel safe making loans when they didn't necessarily have enough money to cover them, because the government was backing them. Well, not the government, but an entity that was essentially backed by the government was there to cover their back. And then so it was this, again, it was belief, right? It was the fact that we believed that this thing that Woodrow Wilson passed into law was powerful enough to protect us and our money in a bank that we would feel safe putting our money in a bank again. This is why a lot of your grandmas buried their money in the yard. Why? Because they didn't trust banks, because they were failing all the time when they were kids, right? And they heard stories from their parents or grandparents who said, look, don't trust a bank. They'll close up, take the money and run, right? Right? I mean, there's nothing, and there was solid belief, there's solid reasons why they did this. It was actually legitimate. But it wasn't because they were crazy, it was because you couldn't trust a bank back in the early 1900s. Okay, so this started to create it. The only problem, of course, is that when we create the Federal Reserve System, what Woodrow Wilson wanted all the banks in the country to do was to agree to the rules of the Federal Reserve System. And so they had to sign up. Guess how many did? 15 to 20%, which was pretty good if you think about it, right? Most of the banks were, they didn't want to be under control of the Fed, and so they didn't. Right? And if they had enough money or they had enough collateral, they were safe. But any of the small banks, they were like, yeah, I want some security. You had to give up stuff, though, right? They had to give reports and prove that they had enough collateral to cover all the debts that they had, et cetera, all the rules that apply to banking. Right? So it started slow. And that's probably a good spot to stop. We didn't quite get through all of Chapter 18. So, didn't quite make it through 18. No homework for this week. Well, the extra credit, put it on to the Chapter 18 homework when we get to it. So, look it up. Again, go to the Federal Reserve Board website, look up M2. They actually have an M3 as well. There is an M3.